So today I want to talk about Black Republicanism. This is drawn from a chapter in my book, the book that I'm finishing up. The book itself is actually not about Republicanism. The discussion of Republicanism takes place on the road to a larger discussion, the sort of central question of the book or central theme of the book, which is trying to sort of think through the sort of normative understanding of democracy that a group of African-American thinkers share. And so I'm telling a story from the 1830s with David Walker, who I'll talk about today. And it really sort of terminates, the project terminates in the 1960s with the essayist and novelist James Baldwin. But for today, I'm going to talk about Republicanism. So let me begin. 19th century African-American political thought and activism, and I apologize, I have no slides, so I'll be reading old-fashioned from a paper. But 19th century African-American political thought and activism draws on two different strands of Republicanism. The first strand, African-Americans find themselves drawing on, is that bit of Republicanism concerned with the civic character of the citizenry. The thinkers we will consider focus on this theme to highlight the failure of the Republican tradition to foster a kind of appropriate manner of behavior, what I shall call comportment, toward their Black counterparts. Black thinkers see the exclusion that they're experiencing as rooted in the motivations and attitudes of the citizens that in turn shape the laws of the polity. They ask questions such as who are we and who ought we to be, largely because they see the political community as an ethical enterprise of invention and development. African Americans direct their intellectual energies to the ethos of the American polity, treating laws and institutions as important, but nonetheless derivations from what we might call the characterological propensities of the nation. And when I use the word ethos, I mean the manners and way of life of the citizenry that really is continuous with and sort of underwrite the rules of the political state. So Republicanism in this guise emphasizes things like civic virtue and political participation and character as central to a self-determining polity. The second strand sort of focuses on the idea of freedom as non-domination. And this comes in the form of African Americans thinking about and trying to escape essentially the internal tyranny of the United States in the form of slavery. Republicanism in this form, as Quentin Skinner and Philip Pettit argue in various ways and in various places, sort of treats arbitrary power exercised over another as the hallmark of slavery. This iteration of republicanism finds its roots in classical Rome, as re-articulated by Machiavelli during the Renaissance, and is defended by thinkers in the modern period, such as Harrington, James Harrington, Montesquieu, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. For this strand, the security of freedom depends on a republic imposing constitutional constraints that guards against arbitrary power and providing institutional spaces that allow citizens really contestatory power to ensure the proper functioning of a constitutional order. The two strands are connected, we might say, in the following way. The characterological orientation of the first helps to realize and stabilize the institutional meaning of freedom found in the second. Now, attending to various figures in African-American political thought allows us to avoid the troublesome interpretive claim by contemporary thinkers that by the 19th century, republicanism was in retreat or already eclipsed. As Quentin Skinner puts it, and now I'm a little nervous because he's on the call, but as Quentin Skinner puts it, with the rise of classical utilitarianism in the 18th century, the idea of republicanism eventually slipped almost wholly out of sight. This point is more forcefully stated by Philip Pettit when he tells us that the Republican idea was displaced without anyone noticing. But surely, when we attend to the ongoing problem of slavery in the 19th century and the ascendancy of Jim Crow in the United States in the wake of the Civil War, we shall find the language of republicanism very much alive. And this suggests that we need only expand our narratives of the past to avoid the blind spot at work in the present neo-Republican revival. But this matters not merely because we should try to be historically accurate, of course we should, but because this 19th century contribution by African Americans helps us to understand something about the nature of racial domination that continues to dog our ethical and political lives, especially in the United States today, and I'll come back to this at the end. So how then do African American intellectuals touch, add to, redeploy the two strands of republicanism? Well, from the 1830s to the 1850s, thinkers such as David Walker, Hosea Easton, and Martin Delany, all Black, all abolitionists, reconfigure civic virtue under conditions of racial domination. Civic virtue is transformed into solidarity among Black people. It becomes a defense of racial solidarity. Yet even among them, they disagree about the political implications of their positions, offering weak and strong versions of racial solidarity. Where some see racial solidarity as a temporary position on the road to reimagining a more inclusive society and in turn transforming American society, this is the weak version. It is someone like Martin Delany who understands racial solidarity as a permanent state, leading to an endorsement of immigration in the 1850s. But it's not just civic virtue that is transformed. Republicanism's commitment to freedom against domination is also complicated when confronted with the problem of racial domination, specifically that of chattel slavery in its sort of modern American form. All of these thinkers are worried about slavery, but the meaning of slavery, a master who exercises power at his or her whim, extends beyond the formal practices of enslavement. Here, slavery's reach is dispersed throughout the culture of American life, circumscribing Black Americans even in instances where there is no obvious master. I mean, for example, Frederick Douglass, I think, succinctly and powerfully captures the point in his 1848 speech to the National Negro Convention in Cleveland, to which he was appointed as president. This is what he writes. In northern states, we are not slaves to individuals, not personal slaves, yet in many respects, we are the slaves of the community. A few years later, African-American poet and abolitionist Frances Ellen Watkins Harper would say of Northern Blacks, quote, "The nominally free feel that they have only exchanged the iron yoke of oppression for the galling feathers of a vitiated public opinion." For these thinkers, to enjoy liberty does not merely involve being free from the arbitrary mercy of particular agents or having laws that would limit forms of arbitrary power, although that's included. But what really is important to them is transforming the cultural system of valuation in which Blacks occupy a lower position of worth. And this could not be achieved by merely tracking institutional domination, but by also attending to its racialized form that generates bad ethical and political habits. So let us first deal with the issue of civic virtue and racial solidarity and the differences that divide some of the thinkers during this period. And we begin with David Walker's incendiary 1829 appeal to the colored citizens of the world. Appeal to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular, very expressly of the United States. I think that's the full title. I think I got that right. So published in Boston, the pamphlet traveled along the Eastern Seaboard through a loose interracial network, and it traveled well into Georgia and as far west as Louisiana in the United States. And on the one hand, the pamphlet marks the end of earlier deferential appeals by African Americans. And on the other, it set in motion forceful criticisms by African Americans of slavery and domination that really became the hallmark of the struggle for freedom. I mean, Walker's appeal confronts the reader with the tragic details of being Black in the United States. And in doing so, it calls into question the very humanity of white Americans. Any man, writes Walker in Article 2 of his 4-article appeal, any man who is curious to see the full force of ignorance developed among the colored people of the United States of America has only to go into the southern and western states of this Confederacy, where, if he is not a tyrant, but has the feelings of a human who can feel for a fellow creature, he may see enough to make his heart bleed, end quote. Now, this invocation of sentiment captured metaphorically in the bleeding heart should not be separated from the theme of character. I mean, Walker participates in the wider intellectual culture of sentimental appeal central to early American moral and political thought. And in the passage just quoted, Walker really aligns the capacity for fellow feeling with the image of being a human. And then he uses this as a moral compass to reorient the readers to the daily treatment of Black people in the United States. And one of the things that must be said is that many African Americans in the 19th century, although not just them, often thought of public sentiment and the character of the public together. These two things ran together as they thought about sentiment and character. So for example, Hosea Easton, a minister and a friend of David Walker, remarks in his 1837 treatise, and the title of that treatise is Intellectual Character and Civic and Political Condition of the Colored People of the United States. And in this 1837 treatise, he says the following: a government like this is at any time liable to be revolutionized by the people. At any and every time, there's a change of public sentiment. Cultivating proper public sentiment toward the harm of Black people, and you will in turn, or so they thought, produce a just society in which all can share. And Walker and Easton were not alone in their thinking. We could also consider journalist and writer Mariah Stewart, abolitionist William Whipper of the 30s and 40s. We can include Douglas and Harper of the 40s and 50s. The sort of emphasis on character and public sentiment is not new, even if it takes on a different articulation in Walker and Easton. It finds some of its most important expressions among classical Republican thinkers, such as Aristotle and Cicero, and is reaffirmed in American thinkers such as Jefferson and Adams. But I think we are likely to miss the difference between African Americans and these more traditionally recognized thinkers and political actors if we conclude here. Whereas Black intellectuals deploy character talk to highlight the fracture at the core of the American polity, others appeal to character and public sentiment to affirm and stabilize the white male portion of the polity that they nonetheless imagine as constituting the whole of society. I mean, this was most certainly the case for someone like Thomas Jefferson. The themes of character and public sentiment are connected to the idea of the common good, central to the discourse of republicanism. For Aristotle, Cicero, and many of the American founders, the stability of the polity depends on proper attentiveness. They all interpret civic virtue as a form of attentiveness that helps to sort of integrate the community. Citizens must, as Cicero writes in On Duties, quote, fix their gaze so firmly on what is beneficial to citizens and care for the whole body of the republic rather than protect one part and neglect the rest. This sort of form of attentiveness that I just referred to. Civic virtue infuses and underwrites political participation and grounds solidarity among the citizenry. So what then is one to do in the face of the differential application of care and concern in the United States? How does one act when one part of the polity is protected, as Cicero worried, and the other is neglected? I mean, these questions animate thinkers like Walker and Easton, allowing them to sort of redirect the gaze of republicanism to the condition of internal slavery and the absence of mutual recognition that define the condition of African Americans in the United States. When republicanism is directed to the condition of Black subordination and slavery, civic virtue does not produce attentiveness to the whole from which one is excluded. Rather, solidarity among the excluded becomes the foundation for responding to the polity as a whole. Civic virtue, now directed to the condition of African Americans, generates a form of solidarity grounded in one's racial identity. So how precisely did these thinkers understand racial solidarity? To answer this question, we need to first get clear about the functioning of racial classification. And let's just do this very briefly. Racial classification takes on the form of assigning meaning to what philosopher Paul Taylor refers to as, quote, human bodies and bloodlines, that permits one to draw inferences about more distant and often non-physical matters such as intelligence, imagination, and moral agency. The meaning of one's racial classification in the 18th and 19th centuries functions as a kind of global category. It allows one to make judgments about particular individuals that fall under or thought to fall under specific racial categories. As Thomas Jefferson, for example, argues in the Notes on the State of Virginia of 1787 in his famous Query 14, regardless of the biological source of one's Blackness, its meaning is of importance for understanding the capacities of Black Americans. Now, although Jefferson advanced this claim as a suspicion, his language, no one doubted the force of his claim that, quote, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, the Blacks are inferior to whites in the endowments of body and mind, end quote. Now, on this view, Blacks literally become interchangeable, no matter where they live in the country. Hence, Walker says to his northern readers, if any of you wish to know how free you are, let one of you start and go through the southern and western states of this country, and unless you have your free papers, which if you are not careful, he says, they will take from you, they will sell you into eternal slavery. And this is because it is the presumed universalism of the category of race that defines the proper status of African Americans as unfree. And it is the presumed interchangeability of Black people in the eyes of white Americans that fuels the defense of solidarity. As Walker says, quote, I advance it therefore you not as a problematical, but as an unshaken and forever immovable fact, that your full glory and happiness, as well as all other colored people under heaven, shall never be fully consummated, but with the entire emancipation of your enslaved brethren, end quote. I mean, this point is echoed again and again throughout Easton's treatise. For both of them, coordinated effort with other Blacks to resist racial domination and transform the system responsible for it is necessary to generate and sustain a successful Black community. Solidarity is thus a functional outgrowth or response to racial categorization. And let me just add as an aside, early Black institutions such as the Freedom's Journal, first Black newspaper, such as the Colored American, the next newspaper to follow, the colored convention movements of the 1830s, all of these were attempts to sort of forge a national Black identity, to forge Black solidarity. Still, Walker and Easton only offer us a weak form of racial solidarity. Walker and Easton's arguments endorse racial solidarity as the initial move toward a more racially inclusive society. They hold out the possibility of ethical and political transformation and seek to awaken their white counterparts to get them to see that in dominating Black people, they betray the meaning of their republicanism. In this, they are not yet committed to the proposition that white Americans are beyond transformation, or that the habit of civility by Blacks and the practice of domination by whites fully exhausts the ethos of the nation. And precisely because they do not subscribe to the idea that white supremacy has fully captured the character of the nation, a position from which, as we'll see in a moment, Martin Delany departs, but because they don't believe this, racial solidarity only expresses itself as a kind of nascent form of group unity that envisions a society, that ultimately envisions a society in which all can enjoy freedom and equal standing. Now, Martin Delany, perhaps the first defender of the theory of Black nationalism, follows the logic of solidarity to its natural conclusions, given what he takes to be the seemingly fixed character of racial domination in the United States. But I'm less interested in the logic of Black nationalism. I mean, this is a theme that has been well trodden, and more concerned to discuss the sort of ethical presupposition regarding white Americans specifically, and the American polity more generally, that really sort of pushed Martin Delany to embrace the political ideology of Black nationalism. So his signature political philosophical text, The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of the Colored People in the United States, published in April of 1852, really represents a sort of powerful indictment of the United States. Here also, Delaney is not alone. You might include someone like Mary Ann Shadd Carey or James Theodore Hawley. These are figures really, I would sort of the 1850s. Their writings of the 1850s are very reminiscent of what Delaney is up to. You might include Edward Blyden and Alexander Crummell of the 50s and 60s, all of whom encouraged immigration, and often as an entailment of republicanism. So Delaney's book is separated from Walker's appeal by more than 2 decades and Easton's treatise by a little less. The transformation of the racial context by the 1850s was far darker than it appeared in 1829. And it directly affected his fellow African Americans in the form of the draconian Fugitive Slave Act of the 1850s. And this is an act that strengthened the earlier 1793 Fugitive Slave Act. So emerging out of the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act required that captured slaves who nonetheless found their way to freedom were really to be returned to their presumptive masters. And there were harsh penalties if this did not happen. Delaney's text addresses the Compromise and the Fugitive Slave Law. And it is this context that prompted him to argue for immigration. So Delaney's interest in the Fugitive Slave Law brings, I think, into sharp focus his sophisticated understanding of the relationship between law and cultural life. And this is really, I think, going unremarked upon in the literature of Martin Delany, what little philosophical literature there is on him. The law for Delaney does not reveal a society that has betrayed itself, as suggested by Walker and Easton, but a social and political community that fundamentally denies the dignity of Black people and depends on that denial, right? It forms its own self-understanding in the face of that denial. This much Delaney says, marking a difference between himself and the earlier thinkers, quote, "We are politically not of them, but aliens to the laws and political privileges of the United States. These are truths, fixed facts that quaint theory and exhausted moralizing fall harmlessly before," end quote. Just as an aside, I mean, his target here was really Frederick Douglass. So he focuses on the Fugitive Slave Law because he takes the idea of positive law to express the sort of underlying ethos of the people. His analysis turns on the distinction he makes in the early part of that book. And there he says that the moral law, the place where one's, quote, sense and feeling of right and justice lies, end quote, is to be distinguished from positive law or the law of the political state. In the case of the United States, positive law is the result of a cooperative enterprise. And the moral law, he argues, need not necessarily determine and guide the positive law. It is very possible for the polity to voluntarily construct laws that express their underlying commitments and be legitimate to that extent, even as they swing free of right and justice. This is how Delaney puts it, quote, "This is the law of the land, and to suppose its repeal, fugitive slave law, is to anticipate an overthrow of the Confederative Union. And candidly, we believe the existence of the fugitive slave law necessary to the continuance of the national compact. Certainly," he continues, "we will not be understood as meaning that the enactment of such a law was really necessary, or as favoring in the least this political monstrosity, but we speak, and here it is, logically and politically, leaving morality and right out of the question, taking our position on the acknowledged popular basis of the American polity," end quote. I mean, for Delaney, the law crystallizes the background attitudinal orientation of the citizenry, but one that stands apart from questions such as, is this right or is this just? But notice what Delaney is doing here. For him, there is a difference between the source or origin from which law issues and its content. Procedurally, if a law emerges from the polity's decision procedure, it is legitimate to that extent. Legitimacy, as he sees it, is about the proper relationship between the physical laws and those on whose behalf the law is issued and over whom as determined by a constitutional order. He thus connects the political foundations of American society to its largely white male voting population, and then uses the outcomes of their decisions as communicating who the citizenry is and in what their commitments consist. In a Republican polity, the only political actors are those described by its constitutional order or positive laws. And since that is the white property portion of the population, he concludes, quote, a people capable of originating and sustaining such a law as this are not the people to whom we are willing to entrust our liberty at discretion. In his keynote address delivered to the National Immigration Convention of Colored Men in Cleveland, Ohio in 1854, Delaney explains the radical transformation required to change the status of Blacks. Listen to this. In the United States, among the whites, their color is made by law and custom the mark of distinction and superiority, while the color of the Blacks is a badge of degradation acknowledged by statute, organic law, and the common consent of the people. With this view of the case, which we hold to be correct, to elevate to equality the degraded subject of law and custom, it can only be done by an entire destruction of the identity of the former condition of the applicant. Now, by identity here, Delaney has in mind the identity that is ascribed to African Americans by virtue of their race, what he calls the badge of degradation that's instantiated in the political and legal and cultural life of American society. The identity of white Americans partly comes about, or so Delaney suggests, by virtue of this contrast with their darker counterparts. And to overcome this condition requires that one destroy the badge of degradation, but notice what this means. It would also involve significantly a willingness by white Americans to destroy the legal and customary badge of superiority they now flaunt. Delaney doubts this possibility, not because he thinks it's unimaginable, but because he believes age is incalculable would need to pass in order to claim victory. And what untold sacrifices, Delaney now can be read as asking, what untold sacrifices would need to be made by Blacks as they wait for whites to become something other than what their conduct suggests and institutions embody. This background understanding frames his account of solidarity. The problem requires not only cooperation among Blacks to resist domination, think of Walker and Easton, but a more significant form of racial unity that eventuates in the founding of an independent state. As with Walker and Easton, civic virtue is racialized, but against the backdrop of Delaney's analysis, it points beyond the shores of the United States. Immigration turns out not to be an affront to republicanism, but an outgrowth of its logic. Now, just checking on the time. So if the last set of remarks allowed us to sort of resituate republicanism within the sort of experiential horizon of Black life in 19th century America, my concluding reflections seek to supplement contemporary readings of republicanism's notion of freedom as non-domination so that it can bring into view the specific implications of chattel slavery. I suppose I'm engaged in some historical methodological violations, but let's see how this goes. So the political philosopher Philip Pettit has provided a masterful, I think, interpretation of the tradition. But when placed against the backdrop of the condition of early Black life, it proves sort of inadequate owing to the emphasis he places on political institutions and his failure to address the cultural background of white supremacy to which the thinkers above sought to alert us. So republicanism, I don't think, needs to be displaced. The thinkers that we've been talking about most certainly didn't think so. But it is in need of theoretical supplementation to properly align freedom as non-domination with sort of the specificity of the conditions confronted by Black Americans. I now think that statement might be too strong, but let me just stay with it. This will also involve disconnecting domination from its primary indicator, namely that of a dominus or master, and connecting it more broadly to culture as such than we find in someone like Pettit. So let me just say a few quick words about Pettit. So in his writings on republicanism, Pettit defends a variant of republicanism that draws from Greek and Roman sources. This version, defined largely by its concern with freedom, argues that, quote, people could enjoy liberty both in relation to one another and to the collectivity only by being invested with the power and status of a citizen, end quote. To be a citizen comes with a distinct kind of power, a power to hold at bay those who would privately or publicly have you at their arbitrary mercy. In the absence of said power, one is under a condition of domination. To be dominated, Pettit tells us, sort of involves a relationship in which one person has the capacity to interfere, this is Pettit, on an arbitrary basis, in certain choices that the other is in a position to make, end quote. What is significant here is that the dominating party need not use their power. They need only have the capacity to deploy their power over you if they so choose. I mean, this is really what it means to be at the arbitrary mercy of another. You just never know when it's going to come. As Cicero puts it, a figure from whom Pettit draws some intellectual energy, quote, freedom, which is not a matter of having a just master, but of having none at all. And the primary example to which Republicans are drawn, as implied by Cicero, is the master-slave relationship. To be a slave is to be at the arbitrary mercy of a master, even if the master is of a benevolent kind. So republicanism counters the danger of domination by specifying three of, I think it's defining elements, the first of which is this vision of freedom as non-domination. And then how is this realized? Well, it's realized through the second feature, body of laws that track the interests and concerns of the citizenry, and that, quote, and this is Pettit again, satisfy a range of constitutional constraints associated broadly with the mixed constitution, end quote. In the event there's need to realign sort of state and society with the first 2 points above, point 3 argues that space must be open for citizens, quote, to contest public policies and initiatives. Now, this is a very brief sketch of Pettit's argument, and I think it's sort of a powerful description of this understanding of freedom as non-domination. But there's a question about whether or not this account effectively addresses the concerns of African Americans. And of course, I'm slightly suggesting that there is some persistence of the concern of the 1830s into, at least in the United States, into our present moment. So I don't think that Pettit's particular version of the tradition of republicanism is robust enough. And the reason it has to do with the different accounts of slavery to which republicanism is a response, namely political slavery and chattel slavery. So recall that on Pettit's account, freedom is always explained as an opposition between citizenship and slavery. And the historical presumption, and this was at work in Aristotle, it was at work in Harrington, as well as the American framers, was that a status that one enjoyed was now denied. And Aristotle, for example, explains Mary Nyquist's political slavery derived its meaning, quote, from an opposition between those for whom it would represent a demeaning and traumatic loss and those for whom it was supposed to be natural, end quote. This idea continued well into 17th century England under monarchical rule. While it was true that the English monarch was supreme over his subjects, it did not follow that he could do with them as he pleased. By the time of the American Revolution, the idea was not that the colonists were seeking rights they did not have, but that they were seeking to reclaim their rightful status as British subjects. For example, in 1774, Jefferson criticized, quote, the wanton exercise of the king's power against the rights of British America. The refusal by the king to respond appropriately led the colonists to address him accordingly in the famous Declaration of Independence, quote, a prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. But let us not lose the true meaning of the point here. The idea was that monarchy and the idea of a free people could fit seamlessly together, and that the king had now acted illegitimately, thus making him a tyrant or a master. From Aristotle to the British monarchy to the American founders, political slavery involved the denial to those of their rightful standing. A dominating figure was one that acted against standing laws and customs or outside the boundaries of constitutional norms. Addressing this situation merely involved proper alignment with standing laws and customs or ensuring the proper functioning of constitutional norms. Hence, Jefferson in 1775 longed for, quote, a restoration of our just rights. The colonists did not create a polity de novo Rather, they established a polity that better aligned with norms with which they were familiar. Pettit's republicanism developed out of this thread of thinking, and this explains why freedom as non-domination is realized through the proper establishment of positive laws and a constitutional order that removes the threat of tyranny. But what if the problem is not about the denial of a status one already enjoyed in a political community? But what if it is about the belief that one's standing as a slave is natural, as was the case for African Americans? If the latter is the case, as I have already claimed, then Pettit's configuration of republicanism will prove inadequate. And indeed, and this is where I might be going a bit too far, the entirety of the tradition that focuses on political slavery will miss the depth of the problem. Chattel slavery is of a different kind because it is tied, in the context of the United States, to, or was tied to normative claims about white superiority and the natural subordination of Black people. It cannot therefore be effectively addressed by the response provided to political slavery. In understanding this distinction between political versus chattel slavery, we should focus less on the figure of the master or dominus that political and chattel slavery share, and more on the idea that in the first case, political slavery, one's status as a slave is a violation of recognized standing, and in the second case, chattel slavery, one's status as a slave is perceived to be natural. One cannot reclaim a status in a community that one never had, and it is this idea that prompted Martin Delany to describe the American polity as alien to Blacks as they are alien to it. It is this second configuration that extends well beyond the figure of the master into the domain of culture itself. And here now, we now have the resources to understand Douglass from 1848 when he writes, "In northern states, we are not slaves to individuals, not personal slaves, yet in many respects, we are the slaves of the community." And this is why Frances Watkins Harper, this is why she lays out this view that it really is a vitiated public sentiment that is the source of the constraints, the source of the domination of Black people. So how ought we to understand this idea of being a slave of a community? And I'm bringing it to a close here. I'm looking at the time. So Douglass actually believes this idea connects the nominally free Blacks in northern states with their physically enslaved fellows in the South. Consider once more a passage I quoted from David Walker. "If any of you wish to know how free you are, let one of you start and go through the southern and western states of this country, and unless you have your free papers, which if you are not careful they will get from you, they will sell you into eternal slavery." Part of what Walker is doing here is trying to capture the way race functions. It has internal content that functions as a universal category that eclipses the sort of subjectivity or the contextual specificity of the lives of individual Black people. But something more is at work here, the elements of which tragically reverberate across time, making the imprecision of contemporary republicanism all the more troubling. As Hosea Easton explains, the meaning of one's racial designation is an auxiliary. This is Easton's language, an auxiliary to slavery and legal codes of conduct following, quote, its victims in every avenue of life. Today, we refer to this as racial stigma because it shapes the social epistemic context, as well as the judgments we make about our fellows. The negative connotations associated with African Americans, Easton argues, are located, quote again, public sentiment, and biases the observing agent. The auxiliary to slavery, these negative connotations, he explains, quote again, is capable of accommodating itself to local circumstances and customs and appearing with all the nature of the old beast, slavery, end quote. The point is that the demeaning qualities attached to Blacks persist through institutional transformations and as such retain residual ideas of the presumed superiority of white Americans and the presumed subordination of Black people. Hence, chattel slavery can disappear, he reasons, and yet continues to cast a long shadow that leaves the civic and ethical existence of Black Americans precarious. Easton is describing the logic of white supremacy that lives beyond any specific institutional instantiation. And this explains why in the 19th century, Blacks traveling in specific states had to carry free papers or their manumission papers. Traveling with free papers was meant to render one exempt from the natural or normal status of Blacks as inferior per the classification, and therefore to the stigma of race, what follows them into every avenue of life. And it is difficult to deny that in our own time, at least in the United States, a similar logic creates a condition wherein the natural or normal status of Blacks easily mingle with presumed traits of criminality or immorality in the minds of observing citizens and conditions their behavior toward Black people, quite independent of the conduct of Black people on display. As Easton's argument implies, this social epistemic context renders the status of Blacks, the lives they lead, and the activities they undertake uncertain, subject to domination at best, and as we have seen at worst, death. And in our contemporary moment, this logic unites, you might say, the new Jim Crow analysis of legal scholar, let's say Michelle Alexander, with political scientists in the United States such as Veshla Weaver and Amy Lerman and Lisa Miller. But it also underwrites references to what we call the afterlife of slavery that you see in a variety of contemporary scholars, Jared Sexton, Saida Hartman, and Eddie Lord. Now, each of these scholars will offer specific historical explanations related to the economic, political, and sort of legal insecurity of Black Americans. But what ties these and other narratives together, however, is the norm of Black devaluation that defines the cultural life of the polity and infuses the distinct areas of social life through which Black people move. And it was the enormity of this framework that prompted Delaney to argue for immigration. Let me see. Okay, I'm almost there. So given the logic of white supremacy, Easton places less weight on the legal response to slavery and more on its cultural workings. And why? Well, because he's trying to bring into view this all-important register of culture. And this is what he writes: the system of slavery and its effects is imposed on the injured party in two forms, or by two methods. The first method is by code of laws originating in public sentiment, as in slave states. The other is prejudice originating in the same public sentiment as it exists in free states. The first method assumes the form of law and therefore is not capable of afflicting such deep injuries as when it exists without the law. Now, Easton is not claiming that chattel slavery does not cause deep harms on those against which it is inflicted. For him, in the context of chattel slavery, prejudice is displaced from public sentiment to codes of law. The law bears the weight of prejudice. In the absence of codes of law, the distinction between Blacks and whites, between the civility of the one and the supposed superiority of the other, must be sustained by public sentiment as such. It must, in other words, find its daily support through the conduct and practices of white Americans in order to police the boundaries between themselves and Blacks. Easton directs his reader to the cultural status of Blacks as subordinates, that is the foundation upon which codified laws and institutions rest, but it also forms the social psychological backdrop, we might say, from which individuals derive norms of regard and disregard. Addressing the problem then is not merely about attending to the existing political juridical framework. Rather, one must seek to disrupt the cultural force of prejudice itself that disciplines both Blacks and whites. Merely to cease beating the colored people, says Easton, and leave them in their gore and call it emancipation is nonsense. Nothing short of an entire reversal of the slave system in theory and practice will redeem whites and Blacks. And what Easton says in the 1830s finds rearticulation in Kimberly Crenshaw's insistence in our present moment that a society once expressly organized around white supremacist principles does not cease to be a white supremacist society simply by formally rejecting those principles. And from the perspective of the 19th century, these thinkers advance their argument about the logic of white supremacy to make a more pointed claim to their Black counterparts. Those that take themselves to be free, let's say in northern states, in contrast, the southern states are confused. And the reason is simple: to the extent that one cannot travel freely across all states, freedom experienced in any one of the states is an illusion. But notice what is going on here. This is not merely a claim about the laws on the books, Walker, Easton, and even Delaney take seriously not merely the practice of slavery, but the memory of servitude and dominance and the ongoing life of stigma it emerges from and simultaneously conditions the cultural sphere of American life that reaches beyond physical chains. And this is why Blacks in the North can also be slaves, albeit of the community. More significantly, freedom turns out to be ephemeral, a temporary break from reality that leaves African-American liberty without cultural support, and in lacking cultural support, freedom cannot remain resilient, and for that reason, it can hardly be called freedom at all. But the response to that, if confined to the domain of legality, will obscure the deepest sense of standing. And from the dark past of the 19th century, we can finally, I think, hear a more compelling argument that speaks to us today. To the extent political rights, to extend political rights to African Americans, as was the case in the 1860s or the 1960s, although important, will do little more than conceal the problem. But the issue is not that they are denied standing they otherwise had in their political community, but that they were not thought fit to have standing at all. And to address this requires one to hold in view the lower position of worth Blacks occupy on the scale of value that animates American life and continues to haunt our present moment. And by attending to the cultural logic of domination, it's precisely this issue that African American thinkers sought to bring into view. Theirs was a reminder that Republicanism's commitment to non-domination, both then and now, demands more than what reliance on the law and constitutionalism can provide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melvin, for a wonderful paper. We'll now take a break for 3 minutes until 7 minutes past 6, and we'll then open the floor to questions for our speakers. So please come back to the call at 7 minutes past 6. I should have said also, you're welcome to unmute yourselves for the time being until the Q&A starts.
Wasim, Quentin here.
Hi, Quentin.
I can't remember on Zoom how you say you want to ask a question. It's a chat function on Teams, isn't it? How do you do it on Zoom?
Well, there should be a raise hand function.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, no, I'm not getting that.
That's very odd.
If you go to participants, Quentin, down the bottom, you'll see a thing that says raise hand, a button.
Thank you. That's it. Thanks, David. What will we do without you?
Better, probably.
Yes. Well, if anyone for any reason can't find that button, please just write in the chat box and say you'd like to ask a question. It is actually 7 minutes past already, and I'm sure people have a lot of questions. So let's start. David Owen, I think you asked first. I've got others in the queue, but David, go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much. And thank you, Melvin. I mean, fascinating. I mean, I started off thinking that actually I wanted to sort of ask about the emigration issue and what relation it might have to the fact that, you know, Black American thinkers are always aware from the beginning that it's not simply an American issue, it's a kind of transnational issue. I mean, the point that Walker registers by saying this is addressed to colored people all over the world. But I then got caught up in your argument. So what I actually want to ask you about is the point about the sort of cultural reproduction. So the question is not so much about the claim you're making that you know, as it were, that there is this sort of cultural norm that's reproduced, but about the conditions of its reproduction. So, I mean, for chattel slavery and the devaluation it involves to kind of continue to be reproduced over time requires that it's expressed and reproduced through institutions, practices, and habits which are changing across the history of the US. So obviously after slavery, Jim Crow, and then, you know, a whole variety since then. So the question arises is in order to address that, is what is needed in your view, or the view of the thinkers that you're engaging with, a direct attempt to change culture, or an attempt to change the conditions that reproduce culture? In other words, you know, should we be looking at sort of some sort of, you know, cultural awakening type strategy, or a strategy that says, no, what we've got to do is break down spatial segregation of Black and white communities, role segregation of jobs, the kind of Elizabeth Anderson sort of line. And I'm kind of interested that from your kind of diagnosis, it doesn't actually, you don't actually hint to us which route or what kind of mixture of routes you think would be appropriate for addressing this cultural norm issue.
Right. So, David, thank you very much for that. I mean, it is a quite important question. Hosea Easton, in his treatise, talks about of course, this 1837, but he talks about the sort of reproduction of a prejudice and racial disregard by narrating stories about the children's stories that were read to white kids, and the ways in which Black people, very different word in that time, how they sort of appeared in those stories to discipline white children and their white counterparts. And here, I mean, the example there, right, is the example of children's stories, children's books, right? But I do think that this sort of second, the sort of conditions that reproduce this culture, I mean, I do think that many of these thinkers, I mean, you most certainly, as you come down through Douglas and into someone like W.B. Du Bois, issues of a sort of proximity and intimacy become quite important in their minds for sort of humanizing Black Americans in the eyes of their white counterparts, and helping white Americans to sort of dispense with their prejudices and their blind spots regarding their Black counterparts. But I suppose what I'm really so that's all to say that sort of that sort of institutional structures that help to sort of bring the lives of the two races into closer proximity was taken to be part of the strategy to dealing with this issue. But I suppose what I really am just trying to sort of bring into view, and I want to put it in that form, just trying to bring into view, is the depth at which these thinkers understood the problem. There's a way in which, in sort of the wake of the civil rights movement, and even now in our current moment, there's a way in which we sort of look at a very sort of robust legal system, and that portion of it that has tried to respond and redress the conditions of Black Americans. And we continue to scratch our heads about the sort of persistence of racial disregard. And it seems to me that that scratching of the head turns on a kind of confusion about the way a law was intended to function. And so part of what I'm trying to suggest here is that if you go back to these figures often thought about laws and institutions as not just simply defensive mechanisms, but as the kinds of things that can create the conditions for reshaping the culture. And if you only think about these things in a defensive way, as a defensive mechanism, then you may lose sight of that which stands behind it, that I'm trying to sort of bring into view, right?
Bruno Leopold.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much, Melvin. I really enjoyed that. And I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we have to think about republicanism beyond, let's say, I don't know, the early modern, the American Revolution, the contributions of the 19th century. It's very much a live tradition in the 19th century. And I was very sympathetic also to the point that it's not just, chronologically or historically important that we understand that republicanism continues, but also that 19th century Republicans transform a lot of the traditional Republican conceptions that you talk about with civic virtue or how we understand non-domination. In terms of, I just wanted to pick you up about something you said at the very beginning of your talk about these two strands of republicanism in African-American thought in the 19th century. So yeah, on the one side, you talked about civic virtue, political participation, citizenry, and non-domination on the other. And I apologize if you said this and I missed it, but how you saw those strands as working, whether you thought those were separate parts of the wider African-American movement, like different figures representing different strands, or if those were mixed together. And I ask because, when I look at the Republicans that I look at in the 19th century in France and Germany, for example, I found this distinction, that often gets talked about in the literature between, the Neo-Roman or Neo-Athenian, as it sometimes gets labeled, to be somewhat unhelpful insofar as these strands are really mixed together in each of the Republicans that you look at, and is not really kind of a separate movement or in a sense like that.
No, Bruno, thank you very much. I mean, that's a very important question. So I suppose I want to say two things here. The first thing is that these things are very much understood as running together. But then I suppose I just want to be quite candid about these figures and what they take themselves to be doing. So I have, in a kind of interpretive way, sort of discussed them within the Republican tradition. But it is not the case that these figures actually take themselves to be trying to correct something within the Republican tradition. They are using a tradition that is at hand for them in public circulation, in discourse. You see it in the periodicals, you see it in the text. There's constant reference to republic and republicanism and civic virtue and the like. So they're using this discourse in circulation. And how they imagine deploying it versus their white counterparts turns out interpretively for me to read as a sort of reconstruction or supplementation of the tradition. And just the reason why I said let's added this second point is because I think the second point partly feeds into why the initial point about the two strands, they run together, because what these thinkers are interested in is how can I grab hold of this language and this way of seeing the world that can address the conditions we find ourselves in? Damn the distinction. How can we respond to this problem of the domination of Black people? And in that respect, this is where we get to the distinction, at least at the level of method, between these figures who really belong to African American political thought, rather than, if you will, something like African American philosophy. Obviously, there's some other claims going on in that distinction, but I would want to hold on to that distinction with the second really being about the problematics of the moment that one is trying to sort of address.
Mhm. Thanks, Melvin.
Josiah Rotenberg. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
You got it right, which is great. Doesn't happen all that often. So first of all, again, thank you for the talk. It's really fascinating. I don't think I'm going to want to engage directly with your discussion of republicanism, but I'm curious about you discussed the period pre-Civil War, and obviously that the Civil War is going to be traumatic. But when you're talking about Delaney, and I apologize because I wasn't familiar with Delaney before, so I just pulled him up on Wikipedia. So I hope I have the right one. But it looks to me, if I do, that he then came back to the States and recruited and fought in the Civil War. And you have this quote that I think is from him that I thought was fantastic, that we need to destroy the badge of degradation. And then I think immediately afterwards, you sort of said that his conclusion, at least pre-Civil War, was that really wasn't in the cards, given where white society was at that point. And so I'm curious, whether, and this is frankly, if I have the wrong biography, this will still be relevant, but how the Civil, sorry?
You have the right one.
Okay. So, it would seem that his personal life, I mean, again, I see one of the first 3 Black men to be admitted to Harvard Medical School, is in many ways, I would think is a perfect example of somebody making an attempt to destroy the badge of degradation, despite what you were telling me earlier that it didn't seem like it, at least earlier, that he thought that was possible. And so, and then I see then I have it right, that then he also then went on into politics and the Reconstruction. So I'm curious how his thought may have evolved, with his experience in the Civil War, whether or not that then put him in a more hopeful place relative to the American, the America of the time, or he just, there's obviously other reasons that may have motivated him. And separately, I'm partially interested because, frankly, that that kind of argument is obviously still also, as you said, is really relevant today as well, which is how do we change the culture? I'm sorry, you could obviously conclude that American society is, just irretrievably broken, in which case, then leaving, may or setting up, some sort of separate republic remains, your only real option. But I personally hope that that's not the case. And then the question becomes, what do you need to do to break down this badge of degradation? And so I'm just curious through these thinkers as they, experience the Civil War and perhaps as a more hopeful place, and certainly somebody like this who participated, and again, certainly I think to some segment of the white population, seeing Black soldiers, all of a sudden they're not cowards. They actually, they're able to, and obviously some of them, many of them, were had very impressive military records. And I think this repeats itself in World War II as well. So sorry, that's a little bit long-winded, but was.
No, I mean, thank you very much. So and you're right, you did have the right, David Walker. I mean, of course, for me, it's the David Walker of the 1850s, and Walker gets admitted into Harvard Medical School by the sort of then Dean Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. And he's quite, Martin Delaney is, and Delaney is actually quite excited about this. And he's admitted, and he's in Harvard Medical School for 1 semester. And then the admission is rescinded. And in the context of this, you then get the Fugitive Slave Act. And this sort of personal catastrophe mingles with this national catastrophe, both of which revealing to him the sort of devaluation of Black life. So in the 1850s, in this treatise, this is a Delaney that does not believe in the United States anymore. That is to say that it could be a home for Black people. I mean, this is the Delaney who writes a sort of public letter to William Lord Garrison. And in this letter, he says, look, I would willingly stay and fight the good fight if I had any hope that the Black man, and it was man here, but that the Black man would get a fair hearing on the American soil. But I have no confidence, I have no hope in the American people. Douglass would respond to that a year later. But so then the Civil War comes along, and Delany thinks, wait, this might be the transformation. So he comes back, and all of a sudden he thinks, that this event might mean something more in terms of what the United States is trying to become. He enlists, he's involved, he's trying to recruit. Delany lives until 1885, so he sees the collapse of Reconstruction, and with that collapse, Delany then returns back to his original 1850 views. They're not as robust in the way that he imagined them before. I mean, he was literally trying to get Black folks to leave. He's still engaged in some immigration efforts, but the collapse makes him think, I was right in the 1850s. And so that's, that's really sort of, but it is, for me, and in this book, it is the position of the Delany of the 1850s, which is actually quite interesting, because it raises a question in the context of the book, that if you attend carefully to the material conditions and historical circumstances of Black Americans, Delany seems right. There is no probability at this moment that the United States will become something other than what it is. And so then it raises a question of, what's the ground on which a Walker, a Easton before Delany, but certainly a Douglass, what's the ground on which he stands to articulate the claim that one should actually, now this is Douglass's language, have faith in the American polity? And of course there, it involves what I try to argue in the book, it involves a sort of normative understanding of the idea of the people as a sort of normative category that can help justify what Douglass calls his sort of faith in the American polity. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry I spoke for too long.
No, not at all. Quentin, that's you next. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Melvin, can you hear me all right?
I can.
Yeah, that was absolutely brilliant, and very important to remind us, and of course Bruno reminds us, that this idea that the Republican story comes to an end is an English story. Of course, it's not the case in the United States at all. I'd like to go back, if I may, to the American Revolution for a moment. I'm afraid this may be more a comment on what you said than a question. But I think that in the revolution, your distinction between political slavery and chattel slavery becomes extremely important, because obviously what's being said in the colonies is taxation without representation is an imposition of arbitrary power. And if I'm subject to arbitrary power, then I'm a slave. But I think it's extremely important that for the first time, as far as I can see in the debate about Republican liberty, a number of commentators come forward in the 1770s, of whom John Wesley is the most important in his reflections on slavery, to say, look, you are not slaves at all. This is a morally outrageous overstatement, and Josiah Tucker picks this up, and Samuel Johnson makes the same point, which is that it's a misunderstanding of what the law has to say about slavery. They're all going back to Roman law, in which the slave is defined as someone who is subjectium dominio. Now, if you translate power, you get Thomas Jefferson's answer: if I'm subject to your power, to your mere will, then I'm a slave. But dominion means property. And they say, look, the reason that you're not slaves at all is that what it is to be a slave is to be the property of somebody else. And what is morally outrageous, two ways round, is Jefferson is not the property of anyone else. Although he owns slaves, he is not himself anyone's property. And secondly, just the point that that's the definition. So there is no distinction between political and chattel slavery. Slavery is chattel slavery.
So maybe I'm trying to be quick here. So maybe you all will recall several moments in the talk where I sort of spoke of sort of not dispensing with republicanism, but it really needs to be supplemented.
Yeah.
And that might be too strong. And I
No,
sort of
no,
said,
I
I
think
said
you're
the
onto
two
something
moments,
really crucial.
right? So I said this at two moments. And it is actually precisely for the reason, Quentin, that you are actually suggesting, because as you say, it was in the Roman law, Cicero is quite clear about this. It was actually always about being the property of another.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. I'm not sure if this distinction. Oh, and I'll make another point about this. John Wesley. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Phyllis Wheatley. Her poems, right? She feeling very bad for the colonists, but she says it's metaphorical slavery.
Yes. Yes.
Partly to capture this point. But I'm not sure that the distinction. So let me say it differently. If I were to sort of reason from the sort of tension within the 1770s around political slavery, it would not be the case that African Americans within this same tradition are without resources to draw from. That is to say, there are American thinkers in the 1770s that would actually be quite and are quite partial to precisely the kind of argument I'm suggesting. I do think, though, as we come on down into contemporary discourse, I'm not always sure that someone like Philip Pettit holds this distinction clearly in view. And I'm very much, concerned about this. So I do think that, so one, I think you're right. That were one to take this seriously, it would, obviously African Americans would be in the tradition, but they would be picking up on a thread of this tradition that seems truer to its Roman sources than someone like Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, absolutely. Could I just say that once you go, I mean, you're quite right. I think the key text here is the Roman law, the discussion of the status of persons.
Mm-hmm.
But the Roman law is extraordinary in that it completely repudiates the whole Aristotelian tradition in stating that being the property of somebody else is contra naturem. It is against nature, so it's a violation of natural rights. And that's the grounding of abolitionism in England.
Yeah, no, that's good. I sometimes struggle with an issue of the sort of interpretive accuracy of a tradition and the tradition we find ourselves living. That is to say, the ways in which the bits and pieces of a tradition are picked up.
Oh, yeah.
Congealed across time. And we as philosophers and historians can go in and say, well, actually, these bits and pieces map on to a much wider landscape that then complicate and render a sort of truer representation of that tradition. But it seems to me that in the American context, it is the Jeffersonian thread with this distinction between the political slavery and chattel slavery that I think we very much find ourselves, or these figures very much found themselves living, and which I think has sort of come to us into our present moment, and which is about being, in some sense, a kind of public slave of the community.
Yeah.
Right. So that, of course, is what someone like Frederick Douglass was up to.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm not denying it. It's just that there is a group of people for whom the very idea of political slavery is outrageous.
Right.
Because, as Wesley says, you don't know what slavery is. I mean, what are you talking about?
So I'm afraid we are at 6:30, but as I wrote in the chat, perhaps we can run till 6:35, but that will only leave us time for 2 more questions. So in the order they were raised, could Manjeet and Hannah, could you ask your questions in turn, and then Melvin can respond to them both? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for a great paper, Melvin. I'm very sympathetic to it. So I have three very short questions, I hope. First is with regard to political slavery. Montesquieu also makes this distinction, and he regards political slavery as being subject to a despot or an imperialist or tyrannical power. And I kind of think that republics historically, notably in Rome, admitted slavery. So I think there's, these hierarchies are there in practice and also in Cicero's thought. He doesn't call for the eradication of all slavery, but these are statuses. So this kind of leads me to my next. That's not really a question, it's more a comment, but I was wondering what you make of why you didn't draw on Aristotle's understanding of natural slavery on the one hand. And then the other thing is, I'm interested in the this new Black republicanism, and whether you're talking about like a decolonized or a post-colonial republic here, because the language is very different. So solidarity, political activism, emancipation, it's a very different framing of languages than civic virtue, political activity, property, difference between labor and service. So I was wondering if you could say something about that. I was also wondering about the language of rights and where that fits in to your story. So, and that's it. Sorry, I had a list of questions. Thank you.
Mhm.
Anna.
I'll be very, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, Melvin. It's lovely to see you. I feel with Quentin and you here, I'm getting flashbacks to the MPhil, which was a long time ago and a very good time. Anyway, yeah. So I was thinking about civility. The idea, I was really intrigued by the idea of civility being the thing that would affect this radical cultural transformation and awaken the minds of white people. And of course, and I was wondering about that, of course, because historically civility has been precisely the thing that hasn't worked. I mean, in the sense that it tends often to reinforce hierarchy and deference, and as we know, power doesn't give anything up without a fight. And so, obviously, historically, one might think that the very thing one needs is incivility. So so it was just a question about what they were thinking about when they were talking about civility. Thank you.
So I think that I mean, I don't know if I did, then I'm mistaken. I don't know that if I did, I need to rethink that. Reference the term civility, power. Power and resistance is very much involved here. Reshaping the norms of proper regard are very much involved here. Because on one reading of civility, this is how you get the sort of policing of Black and brown relationships. And as you come down, and now we're past slavery, this is how you manage the distinction between Blacks and whites, right? Because there's some background norms of politeness and courtesy and proper comportment between, right, that police the boundaries between Blacks and whites. So I would not want to say civility is involved here at all. And I most certainly would want to say resistance and power is very much involved. In fact, all of these thinkers think that, that to answer the demand of freedom in the context of domination means that you resist physically, right? And so David Walker's appeal very much leans on the side of violent uprising if one's white counterparts do not learn the lessons that he is laying out. But he does think that insofar as one takes oneself to be free in the face of domination, resistance is demanded. If I go back to the earlier question, and I'll start with the language of rights here. much of the literature, let's say on someone like Frederick Douglass, likes to go on and see him as a kind of, as standing within the kind of natural law tradition. And they like to go on about his deployment of rights discourse. It is true that rights are very central to Douglass's way of thinking. But what is quite important here that we miss, I think, is that rights are not for Douglass, for David Walker, for Easton, they're not self-executing. They require us to comport ourselves in the light of seeing ourselves as right holders, right? And so the so-called sort of natural grounding of these rights is quite uninteresting outside of a story of action and resistance and comportment. And that bit, which I find most interesting, is the bit that they are constantly associating when they talk about proper comportment with what republics demand of us, right? And so this is sort of why I really sort of emphasize this element. I mean, God is quite central to these figures, but David Walker says, look, we're not gonna, I'm not insisting, and you should not wait for God to come in and drag you by your heads to freedom. God created us in a certain way. He endowed us with a capacity and sense of feeling. We have to now execute it and bring it to fruition in the world. And that requires for them a story of resistance and comportment, not just simply on the part of Black Americans, but also on the part of white Americans. And then the post-colonial, I think that the post-colonial, I think it is a very different discourse. The real question is what is at stake in the different discourses, right? It doesn't seem to me that the language of civic virtue, just to use one term, I don't know if this is what you mean, but this is often what I get when I sort of talk about civic virtue. It does not seem to me that the language of civic virtue need be captured by a kind of political conservatism or a kind of sort of notions of assimilation. It need not involve these. It need not involve these things. And I don't know if I'm getting on with that question precisely. So I think that was it.
Great. Well, I'm afraid it's 20 to 7, so that's all we have time for. There are actually many more questions people wish to ask. I can't take credit for this suggestion as it comes from Hannah Dawson, who just spoke, but perhaps those of us who are here could turn our cameras on to show that we're all here and to give, even if on mute, our thanks to our wonderful speaker for a fantastic talk. Thank you, Melvin.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
And we'll be back on the 2nd of December. Thank you, everyone, and
Thank you.
goodbye.
Thank you.